by 8, because that's the goal. Briefly, we need to say thanks to Chef, the LaPena household. I don't think Bobby helped, but he might have. Nope. So Katie made a great chicken and whatnot. If you see her, say thanks. And if you want to help provide food, I'm sure there's ample opportunity to do that in the next couple of weeks. Make sure before you go, I know some people already grabbed the handout for next week. If you don't have one already, they're up here. We'll make sure you get them, and then we'll get right underway. So, today we're talking about Ruth Chapter 2, not about chicken wings, not about eagle's wings, like Wendell or Rodney was like, why are there wings in the Bible? That was really odd. So, just a little teaser there. We're going to talk about wings for just a little bit, because it's a nice image. Anyway, so this is further expressing the consistent theme of Ruth and the Old Testament, that loyalty to God is rewarded, and this is a two-way street. So, I'm sure you heard this concept already about how this is an important theme in Ruth on display, and so that shouldn't be any surprise. I wanted to take just a few moments to reflect a little bit of how this is sort of further expressing this theme that's consistent in the Old Testament, and see where that kind of comes from, and then see a little bit more how this is in full display in chapter 2 here. So it starts with how God reveals himself to the world. This shouldn't be too big of a surprise, but this is part of how God establishes this relationship with his people. Starting of course, on Mount Sinai with Abraham, he gives some tablets and stuff, or Moses, sorry, not Abraham. And that's sort of one of the major beginning points of it. And this is a two-way thing that it reveals, in all these stories, it reveals God's character and like what he's like, how he acts consistently, and then in turn it obliges himself to act in a certain way in correspondence with this covenant relationship. And so one of the terms you may have heard is this Hebrew term that I'm going to butcher the Hebrew really terribly. I think it has this weird like guttural like chesed sound, which I'm not going to try again because it's really odd, and it's not a common way to speak for English speakers. Have those weird gutturals. Anyway, so this term gets translated a couple different ways depending on your Bible, but it's an important term that is sort of all-encompassing to this notion of great devotion and loyalty and faithfulness and kindness. And this is a staple quality of God, and we're going to see this throughout. If you think about it, from some of the stories of the Old Testament, this is a staple quality that he asks of his people, and when they follow through, then he's going to respond in kind. And so just think about it for just a little bit, the trajectory that we have in the Old Testament, starting in Exodus and Deuteronomy, which traces and describes the history of this establishment of this covenant. And then the book of Joshua gets a nice little upturn where God's faithfulness is pretty alive and well, and the people are doing well. Joshua's raised up, and things are looking good. And then for about 400 years in Judges, things are like really all over the place, right? And we heard just a little bit of that this past Sunday in chapter 6, the call of Gideon, which is just one little small story in the book of Judges where God calls up someone to help him out for a little bit, and then Israel does good for a minute, and then they go back and forth, and then it's all over the place. It's not great. So this is what happens in Judges. It was animated earlier, and I don't know what happened. It had a little tearful emoji, which was kind of fun. So we can be equally sad that the gift didn't work, but that's okay. So one of the questions to kind of ask, that is asked as people read the book of Judges and look at, this long history of God's people, how did the faith actually survive this? If people went so far down and were so often under pretty severe oppression and pretty rough circumstances, how did it survive? And that's where Ruth, this short story, comes into play as a small little snippet or peek at how the faith survives through some common people that answer the call to be faithful, fight sincerely, and how God and his providence is on full display. And then out of this particular story, even King David comes, and then out of David, we get Jesus too, which is great. Wow. Okay, so this is just a bunch of different definitions for that hesed terms. And looking and thinking about it for just a minute, what we've read so far of Ruth, we see this on full display already in just a couple of places. Where Ruth refuses to leave Naomi, and the other sister, Orpah, says like, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and go back to my family, but Ruth stays devoted to Naomi, and she's willing to glean for food, practically begging, because she wants to help provide for her mother-in-law. Again, it's a pretty remarkable story to see how this isn't her own flesh and blood. This is, who she's married into, but, her husband has died. So we see that with Ruth. And then chapter 2 introduces us to this guy, Boaz, who we know has some relation to the family through Elimelech. And we see a couple of places already where he immediately responds in great kindness and compassion and wants to help her out, which is great. And we see this. I want to just briefly shout out how this gets a little callback to why the story is so significant, that in Matthew 1, in that long genealogy tracing Jesus' lineage, that Ruth gets a shout out. Not everybody does, but here this just speaks to the kind of delightful and remarkable quality of Ruth's own faithfulness. That even her, who is not originally part of the Israelite line, gets a pivotal role in God's plan. And thinking about Boaz for just a minute, we first hear about him as this wealthy man of means, and then one of the first things we actually see him do is respond in great kindness. And this is just a way of showcasing how Boaz himself is a great example of someone who is also loyal and of great integrity. On Sunday, when I was teaching the junior high and confirmation class, I was having them try to tell me a little bit about Jesus. And I said, all right, if you're going to tell a friend about him, what would you say? What stories could you tell them that would describe the specific character and attributes that Jesus himself has? And after wrestling with that for a little bit, we told some stories of how Jesus is very quick to heal or be kind to people and raise people up, and all these ways of showcasing immediate compassion. Those are display his true character, and all that is a long-winded way of showcasing how Boaz himself is somewhat of a type of Christ. I was in the notes talking about he's kind of similar in character to Christ too. And this starts from the get-go, from the very first moment we are introduced to him. I don't remember what I was going to say. So, the other major term that gets brought up here in Ruth is this idea of how he is related in kind of an interesting way, and by being related, he has some obligation. That's that Goel term that you may have heard before. And this gets traced back to some specific references in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And these are just short paraphrasings of it all. And this just describes sort of the legal obligation that Boaz kind of finds out that he has by being related through Elimelech. And I want to get to one particular one, which I find particularly fun. The first two, these aren't too exciting. This is just saying, I'm sure we've all heard this idea of, if a brother passes away, then the other brother has to marry and take over and take care of that family too. And he also has to have some means to be able to provide. Nothing too surprising. But the last and most critical one to me that I think is really important comes from Deuteronomy chapter 2, which describes that the person himself must be willing to redeem. If you remember, this is a small spoiler for chapter 3, but it's okay. There's another person that stands in line between Boaz, that there was another person that sort of had first right of refusal, if you will. And this speaks to that, why that person had to be asked. That the person in question can refuse. However, in this particular setting, how it's described, you don't want to refuse because then you'll be called a house of a man stripped of his sandal, which I just find a really amusing description for some reason. And I couldn't find a great cartoon to describe it, so I found the next best, and this is the real reason why I wanted to bring it up. But this is the image, before I show, this is the image that I have of reading this, that the woman comes in law, the sister-in-law is like, this man wouldn't help me, so I took his sandal and I hit him over the head, so this is what I found. It's not quite on theme, it's a different kind of shoe, but whatever, that's okay. And actually it's her shoe, not his shoe, so it doesn't really work. So you can just ignore that. Sorry about that. So, that was long-winded. I don't know why I said that too. That was the Children's Chapel Chipotle thing on Sunday. If you were here for that at the second service, I don't know what I said. And it doesn't matter. I started saying, all the children come, but then I think I said something about Chipotle and not I don't know what I said, but we got it. So, wanted to ask the question about what about us from the story, what can we really take away? So we've heard that loyalty is rewarded, but even as I heard some of the conversation inside the room, and as I read through the story, I'm like, well, I can't really relate to picking up grain and barley off the ground in the fields. I've never picked wheat off the ground at all. But there is, I think, something for us to take away. And so there's this quote from this guy that you don't need to remember, Alred, who has this nice little summary of the story. And then he's going to make an observation here in just a minute. This is just his own sort of paraphrasing of the story, how Boaz responds immediately in great compassion for Ruth's predicament, noting that she herself is not of his own clan. She's a Moabite, and she's on the outside. But he immediately wants to help her out. He doesn't want her to feel shame. And so this is something for us to learn from. In the same way, we ought to more adroitly or cleverly to seek out the needs of our friends, anticipating their requests by good services, and observe such demeanor in our giving that the recipient rather than the giver appears to be bestowing the favor. And I think, at least in my own reflection of the story of how relatable or not relatable the story is, I can't imagine, it's hard to imagine, having to pick up after my sister-in-law, marry her, and that just sounds really weird. But the idea of Boaz, this great man who has means, being so ready to step in and provide and help for someone in great need is something for all of us to learn from too. And this is just a note of that law of gleaning that we talked about earlier, I think last week or the week before. No, that was a snowstorm, it doesn't matter. That there was, written into Jewish law was that people weren't supposed to take advantage and be greedy, and then they were supposed to help provide some means for people to get food, basically. And this didn't require the landowner to actually provide extra food and water, just that he wasn't going to pick all of the field, if you remember that phrasing and all. So this is a lesson of extraordinary kindness. To put it into a little more context of how significant it was that he didn't turn her away for being a Moabite. I don't know if you remember anything about how Moab was founded, but this is the very brief history of it back in Genesis chapter 19, where Lot and his two daughters left. Remember, his wife had been turned into a pillar of salt, and then they realize that they don't have anyone else to have kids with, so then they get locked in a cave, and they both have, I don't know why that did that. Okay, went away. And so they both become pregnant by their father, and so they know the people in Bethlehem here know the history and remember it for being founded in an incestuous way, which is pretty terrible. No one is gonna think oh, that's a good place to come from. So just for a little context of how remarkable it is too of the testament of loyalty that Boaz has to his kinsperson, I think is pretty remarkable. One of the ways he does this, we see this in a very brief exchange, and it started with him asking the foreman in the field, who's that young woman over there? And he doesn't know the situation. Then once he starts talking to her and he learns a little bit about her, he immediately takes on this very familial and paternal relationship, and acts with great kindness too. When he says, "Listen, my daughter, my sister," some translations do use either one. He recognizes in just a moment how Ruth herself has lived and fully given herself over to his God, to Yahweh, the Lord. And I particularly bring this up because I wanted to show another fun picture of Sisera. I all know this movie. It's not really worth the joke, but it's worth the joke to me. And there is a connection. So nuns, as we know, sometimes called sisters, are people that have fully committed their life to God's service. And in a not insignificant way, we see this on display in Ruth's own life too, of how she's fully given over everything that she once had and whatever family she did have back in Moab. She's fully committed to providing for Naomi and fully is on board with God's plan. So that's why we have an image of a fabulous musical if you never heard. The very last thing before we wrap up is I wanted to look at, I think this was a memory verse, and because we're talking about wings over here, someone was talking about wings, not chicken wings, but chicken wings. There's some cool imagery at play, both in the Old and New Testament. So this was in the little interaction between Boaz and Ruth, where he is recognizing what she has done in her life to provide for Naomi, and he's like, God is going to bless you. This little phrase of under whose wings you have come to take refuge. It's a beautiful poetic image that Jesus himself calls back to when he's calling out the scribes and Pharisees in chapter 23. You who kill the prophets and stone those who sent to you, how many times I yearned to gather your children together as a hen gathers her young under her wings, but you were unwilling. It's a nice little image. In Deuteronomy, there's a similar type image, and this could have been on Boaz's mind, perhaps. Describing God found them in a wilderness, a wasteland of howling desert. He shielded, cared for them, guarded them as the apple of his eye, which you might remember from Psalm 17 or from Compline. As an eagle incites his nestlings, hovering over its young, so he spreads his wings, took them, bore them upon his pinions. All these are wonderful reflections and images and illustrations of how God wants to protect his people as a bird might protect its young. And King David recounts a lot of these images in Psalms, multiple times throughout, and these are just a couple that I find really beautiful. And I think these display this particular type of blessing that Boaz is recognizing and calling for and expecting for Ruth's life, that we can see sort of are inspired by this type of interaction, because David would have known the story too. And so all that is a long-winded way of saying how God's protection is given to those who seek refuge. So people deciding to make a choice to actually trust and follow, and then the expectation is that he is going to respond. So that's all a bit about Ruth chapter 2. That's all we got. Any burning questions? Otherwise, we'll see you next week. Don't forget, handout for next week.